Speaker, and audiences are welcome to the quarterfinals of NEAO. And in today's debate, we would like to suggest two things as the open government. First, we want to state clearly that the sovereign government has all its justification to accept the individuals to accept to its own values when upon receiving immigrants for their social security, national security, and also. But then further on, we think that this policy actually initiates a changes in individuals' values. We also think that under the status quo, if we keep receiving the individuals, it will actually create more hatred towards the individuals, which oppose social values of today's to the states that is receiving the immigrants. So, Mr. Speaker, as the first speaker, I'm going to talk about two things. First, the justification and the government responsibility, what the states are doing correctly to initiate selectivity upon where they choose their immigrants. Second step of analysis, we're actually going to elaborate regarding how change the individuals through this policy and how it's beneficial for the immigrants that are moving in, and also how it's better for the states. Now, Mr. Speaker, before going on to anything else, we want to contextualize and we want to clarify what we mean by this motion, right? We want to contextualize this into a liberal democratic country where we do promote some of the values that actually go for humanity, that are which promotes equality, right? But further on, by social values, we mean several steps of analysis, right? We first think our policy is very simple. We think that these kinds of individuals who have opposing values to the nation that they're trying to move into, we're not going to accept them. So how are we going to determine it, right? We don't think this debate is about feasibility, but rather it should be about principles on why we should do it or not, right? So we're not going to be talking about the specific feasibility, but what we're basically doing is we're setting up a system which will actually clarify and clearly determine whether these individuals have the opposing values or not, right? But under the premise that these individuals do have opposing values, Mr. Speaker, what we mean by social values are basically several things, right? We think that ideology difference, such as you supporting a dictator who for example, if you're a German and if you support Nazism or Nazi killing, we think we're not going to receive those kind of individuals. We also think that the ideology difference, for example, you serving for a totalitarian leader or terrorist, we also think that we're not going to receive those individuals. But further on, by social values, we also mean cultural values. For example, if you're from a nation which discriminates these kinds of women, discriminates a certain race, we also think that under those values, because we promote equality, we're actually denying the access of those motions. But before I go on, just quote it.
So in the case of an LGBT, when he wants or she wants to go to a foreign country, just because that country denies such gay rights or LGBT rights, that these people should be denied from immigration?
Mr. Speaker, if they clearly listen to our contextualization, we said it to liberal democratic countries with freedom of values. In these kinds of states, we think that we want to contextualize it into states where they promote equality on what kind of race, what kind of situation, whatever, Mr. Speaker. In this kind of a case, we want to promote equality. Now I'm going to go on to the two substances regarding justification, government responsibility, and second regarding how this actually changes individuals, why this is the only way. Mr. Speaker, regarding justification, right? We think that if nations do feel threatened or do have a certain value that they want to promote in society, they have all the freedom, right? We think there are actually several criteria regarding when you impose a border quarantine or impose a certain denial of these kinds of immigrants. For example, when the nations actually feel a threat or a harm within their policy or within these immigrants, they do deny certain access. For example, there's a reason why we go through that is why a certain selectivity upon receiving immigrants exists in the status quo. For example, America, when they're trying to issue green tickets to people, we do have examination. You do have to fulfill certain criteria, such as whether you're patriotic to the nation or not. You do have to sign to a certain value or vow to a certain value to the value that the principle that the nation states. But further on, we also think that we require in France, for example, you do not for example, the government does regulate some of the opposing values that happen in the nation. For example, you deny the concept of burqa from the very beginning because they do not want to see discrimination or cultural discrimination among women going on. So states do this, they do have a right. But further on, Mr. Speaker, we think that when there is a certain threat or harm within their society, upon receiving these immigrants, the government does have all the right. For example, we think from these opposing values of immigrants, we also see cases of cultural divide of how they're coming in job places, or when they're working upon, or when they're trying to promote the values, people example, actually, you know, in first case regarding the differentiated social values, we do see crimes, we do see identity crisis, we do see these kinds of clashes going upon individuals. But to the second step of analysis, for example, we think the nation is threatened among, you know, when they're receiving the individuals from different regimes, different ideological societies. That is why South Korea has such strict policies when they're like receiving these kinds of immigrants from North Korea, right? But we actually think that in these kinds of cases, no, thank you, sir. In these kind of cases, the state has all the right because it's for the principle of self-defense because its security is threatened. So in these kinds of cases, Mr. Speaker, we do see like a limit that a country imposes upon receiving a certain immigrant. No, thank you, sir. I need to go on to my second argument. So going on to the second argument, right? We actually think that the value that we want to promote in the international society regarding equality, we actually want to like promote these kinds of values, like, you know, reducing like gender discrimination or reducing racial discrimination, or these kinds of things that go into the society, right? We actually think that, you know, the premise that we are making upon these immigrants that we're talking about is that their values do infringe upon certain rights. For example, the rights of women, the rights of racists, or, you know, like even supporting like this kind of a dictator who like commits these kinds of massive crimes, right? We think that in this kind of a case, we think this policy is the only thing, right? So let's look at the characterization of these kinds of immigrants. For example, these immigrants who are going into the developed countries or liberal democratic countries, they do have a certain incentive. For example, they want to earn money, or they want like better social welfare. In order for them, so they're incentivized anyway. They want to use any means in order to like go into these nations, enter these nations, and gain benefits from these nations. So what we do, right? We actually think that in order for them to go in, now they need to like subject themselves to the social values that the country that they want to go into like presents, right? Yeah. So for example, when these individuals actually have to conform their values into these equality, we actually think that this is a moment where we actually incentivize the individuals to change their social values into the one that we want to promote in the very society today, Mr. Speaker. In this kind of a case, Mr. Speaker, this is the policy that we should be going for. So why not after they go into the society? Why can't they integrate? But why does this have to take before like they go into the society, right? Because we think in the correct status quo, when these people with different opposing social values enter these societies from the very beginning, Mr. Speaker, first step analysis, number one, they cannot adapt fully to the values that are prevalent in the society. So what does this create? These individuals cannot anchor fully with the nation, which are in the citizens itself, but we also think they actually go for a hard time in adapting to the new values. But we also think that there's a occurring within these individuals, you know, occurring in the society. Therefore, we actually think that this kind of value change, individual value change, has to take place before they go to the society. And because they're incentivized, this is the only way to change those kind of individuals' values. Thank you.
Right, I thank the Speaker for her fine speech, and to open the case for CUHK1, I call upon Samuel.
Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that in no case does the government have legitimacy to dictate a set of ideology, especially in liberal democracies where we actually accept all kinds of failures to coexist in a society. We think this policy is anti-democratic and is harmful to the state and to the country itself. We say today the government side has two burdens of proof. Firstly, they have to prove to us that receiving these immigrants are actually harmful to society, and secondly, that these harms actually outweigh all the benefits that for us to accept them. In my arguments, I'll prove to you that both premises actually fall by saying that firstly, the state does not have this legitimacy to decide, and secondly, how preventing these immigrants actually prevents the economy from growing, and thirdly, how this will actually close the doors of discussion and also block cultural diversity, which is crucial to liberal democracies. But before I go into my arguments, I have three rebuttals. Firstly, the questions that we have in the opening gov is, how does the government decide prevailing social values? They seem to presume that as long as that country is a liberal democracy, all the values that the country upholds will be correct. We say that, firstly, it is against the very value of liberal democracy, which they accept that most values are not 100% correct, so they actually accept all values to coexist. Second response, we say that even if liberal democracies, like say America, a lot of states in America still deny gay rights, and we don't see like how it actually helps the case. Thirdly, we say that a lot of failures actually still not settled, and therefore we are still having a lot of debates like right now. And fourth response is that even if some failures are objectively true, it will still be helpful for us to have descendants inside society because discussion and debates will still be helpful to strengthen those failures itself. Okay, second rebuttal. They talk about like self-defense. We think that this is like a very... This is an argument without analysis because we say that just because someone has a different failure, it doesn't mean it is a terrorist or it's an enemy. We say that by saying that you're already prejudging those immigrants and you're actually discriminating them, and also you're actually closing the door of discussion to them. We say this is not helpful to the country at all. Third rebuttal, we say that they're trying to say they want to instill those social values into those immigrants. Few responses. Firstly, we say that those immigrants will just fake that they have those social values and the government has no way to find out, so they're not really changing the hearts of those immigrants. Secondly, by having that policy, those people will not dare to speak because they will not dare to speak their voices out because the government already said that if you have otherwise values, we will just kick you out. Thirdly, we say the government in the very first place does not have this right to instill their values. It doesn't have the right to say that like you have to be a Catholic or you have to be like uphold blah 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 blah. We say the government does not have that right to do so, which comes nicely to our arguments. But before that, yes, and you're right. Yes, closing.
So if we have actually a citizen who believes that their state is the only way to go, in other words, no other religion other than their religion is the best, how is accepting those citizens ever creating a harmonious environment that the state wants it's in the state's interest to hold?
You say it in two ways. By accepting it, firstly, you actually allow a discussion between them and to the people who actually believes otherwise, thus actually helping strengthening the values of the country itself, and secondly, you also help perhaps creating a chance to change that person itself by exposing him to a lot of people actually accepting different values. We say that exposure is the crucial case in this chain of change. And by having this policy, you're blocking exposure to both the immigrants and to the people in the country itself. Now coming down to my arguments. Firstly, we believe that the state does not have the legitimacy. What this policy is that this policy, firstly, it upholds certain social values, and secondly, it uses those social values to decide who is inside the country and who is out of the country. Essentially, what this policy means is that there are dictatorial people who come in to have, or they must uphold and accept certain values. Why does the state not have the right to do so? We say that all social values, or most social values, are subjective and temporal. They are not really objectively right. Unless the government side really can prove to us that a lot of values are actually objectively right. But even if they are objectively right, we still say that by having discussion, it is still better. And the government side does not have the legitimacy to decide which is right and which is not. It should be left to the individual to decide. Therefore, by using it to actually decide who is in and who is out, will actually lead to immense harm. Firstly, we say to the state itself, actually leaves out a lot of economic benefits, which I will tell you in my second argument. And also, it will actually blocks out a lot of people who actually can create different forces in the society. And also, it will actually oppress the minority who actually uphold otherwise inside the country already itself, which my partner will prove to you further in his substantial material. Now coming down to my second argument, we say it's not just that the state does not have legitimacy, but by having this policy, you're actually harming the state itself from preventing a lot of potential immigrants inside the society. We say on three levels. Firstly, on how it is actually necessary to have those individuals inside. Secondly, how this policy actually block out a group of immigrants, and thirdly, how it actually deter the rest. Firstly, on necessity, we say that for a lot of liberal democracies, a lot of Western governments, which the opening government try to characterize it into, they have a very low birth rate. They have a very little workers, and a lot of countries like Italy or Greece, their working rate is simply not growing a lot. They need a lot of both unskilled workers and a lot of talented workers to go into the country. We see why is the status quo right now. While America is blocking out a lot of immigrants, we see countries like Australia, they're trying to lower and lower again their immigration barriers so that they can accept more talented people, more skilled workers into their countries. We don't see why a Muslim professor or Muslim technician cannot contribute to the country itself. And we say that however, this policy will actually block out a lot of them because essentially we say a lot of religious people actually believe that only their religion is right? But just because they believe that only their religion is right does not essentially mean that they will kill everyone else. It is only the most extremist group inside the Gaza area or perhaps some area as well who actually does that. And even if those are people, we say that exposure still help. But essentially they're not blocking out this group of people. you're deterring the rest. Why is that so? As you have said, social values are not unchangeable. It can be changed. It is not like forever like the same. So what you say is that a lot of individuals will feel like now we're actually having a barrier that will be changed anytime. So they're not really feeling safe to enter these countries. What will happen is that they'll be flowing to other countries instead. In that case, you're actually preventing potential skilled and unskilled workers into the country first, stopping the economy from its potential growth. And lastly, how this actually block cultural diversity. We said this diversity happens on two ways. Firstly, you have different forces, and secondly, you have to have that acceptance. This policy will deter both because firstly, you're actually preventing different forces from coming in by actually upholding a mono force inside the country and blocking other people out. And secondly, you actually reinforce the people who uphold the mono force that they are always right. Because you say that as long as people hold different thoughts, they are wrong and they're not accepted in the country. So people will think that they are always right without discussion, without thinking. We said this is very wrong because the government may not be always right and prevailing social diversity may not be always right. Therefore, the government has no legitimacy, and by doing so, you harm the entire government. Thank you.
Right, I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and to continue the case for UR4, I call for the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we believe that when you come to Rome, you have to actually follow the rules of Rome. When you come to Rome, you have to follow their regulation, you have to follow their laws. So at the end of the day, you just don't go around acting upon your values and doing whatever you want. Mr. Speaker, we have a very clear distinction when we accept immigrants into their countries, certain criteria valuing and subjectively valuing these individuals for their action. When they actually come into their country, they don't create the harms because state never values the immigrants more than their own citizens at the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, they come up with a case by saying that there will be discrimination upon these individuals. Mr. Speaker, we believe that discrimination happens all the time when we actually invite these immigrants to come to the country. Mr. Speaker, we believe it's very legitimate when we have a test to give the green cards to these individuals, to let them know, to make sure these individuals are known to Western culture in general, and we also test them of their English legibilities and capabilities in general. Mr. Speaker, that we believe that it's direct discrimination for those who cannot speak English in general, who seek still the opportunities of American dream, but who cannot speak English are also discriminated. Therefore, when you accept this immigration, there are certain criteria that are selective. And also, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the selectivity and this legitimate discrimination should always exist because the state always values their own citizens more than the immigrants themselves. Therefore, when these individuals come without the values, for example, France people are very threatened by the individuals who still decide to wear burqa and have this empowerment of women, this minimalized because of their actions themselves. They have their own right to value the citizen's security, the security of the citizen over the value of the threat that's brought by the immigrants at the end of the day. No, thank you. And secondly, they talk about how it's blocking and deterring these individuals who are coming in because, we have such low birth rates, etc., etc. Mr. Speaker, we're not blocking every immigrant who wants to come into this country at the end of the day. We want to block these individuals who are not following the criteria that is set by the government themselves to protect the security of the individuals for the collective security of the whole country in general. So when these individuals come into the country, Mr. Speaker, we believe that they have all the right to oppose this threat these individuals bring and allow these individuals who are willing to follow the rules of Rome and actually follow the regulation, maybe the rules of law that is opposed by Rome. Yes.
We're just saying saying that social values are not laws. Social values are not regulations.
Mr. Speaker, we believe that the social values itself also creates tension, unlike the law itself, which can actually regulate. The social tension creates more harms, which directly leads to my argument, which will also rebut to the case how these individuals would deter from actually blocking the barriers, will also be removed under our case, will be also higher under our case. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the creating tension because of their policy themselves within the domestic level will further prevent the entrance of other immigrants who we actually believe will actually contribute to the society, will bring the intelligence and actually contribute at the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, these individuals actually are beneficial in immigrants who are not opposing the immigrants in general, bring diversity, and we believe in the coexistence of sharing the values themselves. However, let's look at the immigrants who are actually opposing the value, the cultural value themselves. Mr. Speaker, these individuals who are not seeking asylum themselves but actually come into the country like France, a liberal democracy, and wearing the burqa because that it is their value and it's the value that upholds in their own selves. And majority of the people who have never seen the burqa in the first place and who oppose the idea of actually hiding the woman within the black clothes within closed black clothes. Anyways, our women are not respected at the end of the day and hiding their faces and not being sure of who these women are and who this identity of women are when you're walking down the street and whether there might be terrorists or not, Mr. Speaker. This creates a tension within the citizens themselves when they see that these values are not met, created by the people who have the collective idea that the security comes from people being able to recognize the neighbors, being created by the values, that the norms, that the security comes from knowing the individuals are secured out of the terrorist values. No, thank you. At the end of the day. So what happens, Mr. Speaker? These individuals feel the compelled threat and intimidation coming from these individuals who are not following the social values. Therefore, irresolute to lessen but to raise the level of pressure or threat or tension are created from their action in the first place. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we see that reoccurring the rounds of the opposition of the social norm coming from these individuals stimulate the actions to carry the high risk, forming the identity about the immigration, the people of the immigrants at the end of the day. So when these ideas are formed around this very minority people, these very minorities who are acting out of their own values, people start to think and create stereotypes around these individuals and forming the idea upon the citizens or upon the immigrants in general, Mr. Speaker. So even though this might be the very minority, 1 out of 1,000, when this person starts to create this tension between a collective threat to the security, Mr. Speaker, the person who already feels threatened, when they see other immigrants who might not oppose the idea themselves, however, they feel that they might create this harm when they actually come into their country at the end of the day. So whether it's a person from the same nationality or the immigrants in general, Mr. Speaker, they feel the threat that these individuals might occur because they have experienced in the past that it had happened before. So when this idea of influence has been formed around this idea among the citizens themselves, Mr. Speaker, we see that what happens in today's society is that people start to complain. So what does happen when people start to complain upon this idea when their security is actually threatened by these individuals? Mr. Speaker, we believe that not only does immigrants come in and feel very stigmatized by the people themselves, but also when they're actually passing the laws or accepting these immigrants at the end of the day, when people start to believe that these immigrants might create harm to society, for example, collective, your security being not identified and protected at the end of the day, this process of accepting these immigrants will be harder and will be more difficult to allow these individuals to come in the first place. So these individuals who actually seek asylum or seek happiness or economic benefit who comes to the country themselves, these people will also be stigmatized because of the stereotype or the norms that is created because of the people who are opposing the values of these individuals. Therefore, we believe that the people who bring cultural diversity will also be blocked. People who actually bring intelligence and coexistence of different values created in society will also be blocked by their faith, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, we want immigrants to actually come into the country and live a happy life where we can also coexist and share same values. However, on their side, they're only stigmatizing these individuals and creating a stereotype of them, creating a further barrier and more barrier so that these individuals who are not opposing will never be allowed, will never have the chance to actually come in because of the stereotype created by them. Thank you.
Right, I thank the speaker for a fine speech, and in the continued case of CHK1, I call for the deputy.
Mr. Speaker, we think that in order for the government to win the debate, first of all, they have to prove to us that by letting these people to go into the countries, this will bring a lot of social harms, which we think that they have failed to do so. The claim that they talk about is, if those people go into the society, they will harm the society because they will form an atmosphere that the society is unsafe, so the citizens will feel a sense of insecurity. But we believe that, by claiming, even if you have that immigration policy to screen out different groups of people who possess different ideologies, this does not distinguish them from even if I'm a person who claim that I believe in the ideologies of your state, that doesn't necessarily mean that I won't be a killer in certain states. We found that in a lot of cases, in a lot of states, those people who are killer, they might just be the normal citizens in the state themselves. So we do not think that their policy is actually differentiating them from the status quo. And today I have two arguments to prove to you. The first of all, I'm going to tell you how their policy is oppressing the minority in their own country. And secondly, I'm going to tell you why an immigration policy should be as open as possible. But before that, I'm going to give two rebuttals. First of all, I think that the government side today have made a serious assumption by saying that by possessing the ideologies which is opposing the prevailing values of the receiving state equals to they will actually commit crime in that receiving countries.
Sir.
We don't think there is a necessary linkage in between.
Sir.
We say that even if that is the case, in the status quo in the receiving country, there's already legal instruments to prosecute a person who discriminates others, who actually commit crime in the countries. So we don't think ideologies actually dictate the behavior of that individual. So, for example, if I'm now debating with you and I'm sharing different ideologies with you, it doesn't mean that I'm going to harm you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to hurt you. So we think that ideologies doesn't dictate behavior here. And secondly, they also give the examples of language requirement, which is we're discriminating against people who doesn't know how to speak English. We say that this is non-comparable with social value requirement. In the very first place, language requirement is objective that you can test. Moreover, in the states language requirement, we also see that the requirement is not as high as you have to be as fluent as debater. It just makes sure that you have to be able to survive in a very basic environment, basic communication. But you are telling an absolute standard of social value, which is subjective in the very first place, in the name of social security. We think that in the very first place, you're already discriminating people who may threaten your national security, and in the second place, before you prove that person is actually guilty, you already punish them by not letting them go into your country, which is essentially against the presumption of innocence in democratic countries. And also we think that when democratic countries actually uphold the freedom of thought, while they deny the freedom of thought of people in other countries, we think that this is also against the democratic ideals. Before I move on to my first argument about why states should uphold the role of neutrality, otherwise it will harm the minority, I'll take the opening.
Regarding the freedom of ideas, even in liberal democracies, there are certain ideas that they rule out, such as discrimination, that they want to impose upon. Regarding these kind of values, liberal democratic states have all the rights.
Yes, the discrimination in a great sense, democratic countries is denying the right to denying discrimination. But in a narrow sense, in a lot of contested debates about gay rights, about religious conflicts with gay people, that kind of discrimination is also debatable. And that's what I'm going to tell you, even in democratic countries, there are still people in the minority who want to have the right to conscience to discriminate against gay people, especially in religious context. So, what actually is in the status quo of those democratic countries is that there is already a kind of segregation between, in the context of LGBT rights, between the religious groups and also the gay people. We say that like the majority of people believe that we should uphold democratic ideals, that we don't discriminate against gay people. But then those religious group people also fighting for their rights, and they're the minority. If the government like actually enact this policy, the message that the center society is that those religious people who discriminate against others are evil, because the government also screen out other people who don't believe in this like ideals. We say that in this case, in this particular case, the state is no longer becoming a neutral agent that is what to resolve in like individuals' dispute. We say why it's so important to for the state to remain as neutral as possible is because first of all, the state has no right to actively encourage certain form of ideologies, and secondly, by being neutral, it is important because whenever there is dispute between different parties, people will have the incentive to resort to the state. And now under that policy, the minorities in the receiving countries have no incentive to resort to the state when there is a dispute, because the state is already showing active like support to certain forms of ideologies. And we say that the harm of their policies in the second level is that, like, as my Prime Minister has already told you, that the prevailing social values in the receiving countries is ever changing. It's not a fixed concept, ladies and gentlemen. When it is so arbitrarily decided by the state that certain prevailing values should be upheld, it is a deterrent to a lot of immigrants, because they do not know when like that kind of ideologies will change like in the course of time. So what happens is that they're going to lose a lot of benefit, like especially in economic aspect that the immigrants can bring to the country. And we believe that the governments have never responded to the benefits that ours have proposed. And bring to my second point about why we should set the immigration policy as open as possible. Because we believe that if they deter immigrants, the benefit that like outside have already proposed will be all denied. And there's a good example of the United States. We see that the United States is or the North American states is the most like welcoming and diverse immigration countries in the world. And we see that why they have such a high level of development in terms of like technology or innovation is because they don't discriminate people that possess different different ideologies. They only screen out people who who they see as huge economic burden. They only screen out people who basically can't live in the country due to a serious language barrier, but they don't screen out people just because they have different ideologies. So we believe that in the status quo we already have enough criteria for the state to screen out other people, but not by using its very subjective standards of prevailing ideologies, and that's why we are very proud to approach.
Right, I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and I close off the top half. And to begin the case, we're closing half, and here you two are called.
Mr. Speaker, funny enough, after 4 speakers, we have not heard a single analysis about what it means to be a citizen and why immigration is an ever more important issue when it comes to accepting or denying certain individuals into your home country. So we as the closing government will give you unique contributions on 2 levels. Number 1, why is the state's duty to make sure that it does not add on additional burden that it needs to take care of in order to maximize the benefits of its own citizens. But secondly, what it means to be a citizen and why this policy of adding another barrier, or perhaps adding another examination to see whether you're whether you're socially willing to accept the values of your new country or new identity, why that's important, why that's a necessity that we need to impose upon the state, impose as a state. Rebuttals first. Basically, we can sum up OO's arguments on 3 things, right? Number 1, states' values are not always right. Number 2, there's a necessity of discussion and discourse. And number 3, receiving states also need them too, so let's open our borders. First of all, Mr. Speaker, we agree, states' values are not always right. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. As long as you are a state, your very reason for existence relies on those values. Because ultimately, those values are the foundations of your law, of your institution, of your policies. And we tell you, we're not making a moral judgment here. We're making whether you can survive or not as a state. Secondly, necessity of a discussion. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that discussion doesn't have to happen just because you're a citizen. We tell you that if you want discourse to happen among, the Iranians and the Americans, do so in public forums. Why is there a necessity to accept these people as immigrants, as citizens of your own state, in order to instill an open discussion to happen? Thirdly, needed by the receiving state. Mr. Speaker, we think this was a ridiculous fluff argument. That was a waste of our time. If you want people to work in your 3D industries and your factories, issue them working visas. We're fine with that. Issue people to come along to, I don't know, give birth. The fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is, guys, we believe in the quality, not the quantity. Just because you have a huge population doesn't mean your state's going to be better off. For them to say we're lacking babies, let's have, foreign babies, it's not really going to solve the issue. So let's move on to our points. Now, no, thank you. Now, we believe it's in the state's interest to sustain itself by doing two things, right? Number one, by creating institutions that foster an environment for your values to sustain itself, these social values that we talk about. And secondly, to raise citizens that are going to forward these values. We're not saying that they're going to sustain as in have a deadlock of where your values are forever the same for centuries to come, but nonetheless forward the direction of which your country aims to be. When we talk about social values, the OG attempted to talk about it, but let's contextualize it even more. We tell you that we're talking about things like gender equality, freedom of speech, those social norms, even respecting your elders in Northeast Asian countries, who knows, right? We think that these values are important because ultimately they translate into policies. If you're a Pakistani man who believes that your daughter should not be educated, we think you shouldn't be an American citizen because that goes against American values of educating your children regardless of gender. We tell you those are the citizens that we hope to prevent because they obviously oppose to the social values. The opening opposition would like to misrepresent us by saying, oh, if you have a different ideology, you're barred forever. The fact of the matter is, it's not a matter of different ideology, it's about the environment that you were raised to believe in those ideologies. If you were in Iran, that it was okay and justified for you to stone women because she winked at another man, we think you don't belong, because in the US you're going to do the same thing and stone any woman who winks, right? So we tell you those are the problems and the social norms and the value that we're trying to protect ultimately in our society, because we tell you, just like language, just like culture, social norms have an ever-changing impact on your life, sustaining a life in a new country as a citizen. Yes, David?
So basically what you're saying is that all of that criteria of a social value is just one thing, nationality. And how are you gonna, I guess, distinguish individuals that is in the same nationality that also agrees with the social value of another country?
I guess it's the mechanism feasibility, right? They're gonna lie their teeth through, how are you gonna ever distinguish them, right? We tell you that mechanism, I'll deal with that later. Anyways, okay, citizens. So citizens, when it comes to citizens, there's two things. Number one, you're provided opportunities to change the state, right? You're allowed to vote, you're allowed to run for candidate, you're allowed to become a diplomat, you're allowed to do various things. You're also given the right to a secure environment where you can grow, right? But secondly, and most importantly, you are also, with these benefits and opportunities, you're given a responsibility to do two things. Number one, the willingness to abide by the rules that your state instills upon you. But number two, more importantly, willingness to contribute and invest onto the very community that you belong to. Mr. Speaker, where does this willingness come from? This willingness comes from identities. Your identity and loyalty to the state that you belong to. When we talk about immigrants who are applying for new citizenship, we believe that they lack a certain identity and belonging to the state that they come into. No matter how much they want to become American, it's probably incentivized because there's new working opportunities or new educational opportunities. We think that the form of identity doesn't come. That's why we believe it's justified for states that are receiving immigrants to set the bar quite high, to make sure that you are willing to change your identity, you are willing to pay loyalty to the state that you're about to come in. That's why we give you language exams. That's why you have to know the first president of the United States to become an American citizen. That's why you have to know the history and culture of that country. Because we tell you, as arbitrary as it sounds, nonetheless, when that knowledge is instilled in your brain, that creates a sense of national identity. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, we see a lack in the status quo, because we tell you it's not just about facts, about history, about race. We tell you it's really about, ultimately, the ideology and the values that you want to uphold as a citizen to truly belong and forward the values of that country. Because when we think about the American, when we think about Korea, right, you have this sense of belonging because we're of same ethnicities, majority of the population, right? When we talk about most liberal democracies, there is no sense of ethnicity or belonging or history. The only way that you can hold on to an identity is through by sharing of the same values and principles to sustain a society. And that's why we tell you, when we're talking about citizens raised in a different value system, raised in a different environment of how you can have an outburst of political values, we need to have a higher barrier. We need to create, because ultimately they create problems, because simply they can't adjust to the social values. Ultimately, because even the aspiring individuals of that community are not able to achieve their dreams. Because, Korean towns in the US are getting a bad reputation for not assimilating into the US culture, Korean Americans who aspire to become politicians are having a hard time. Ultimately, when we talk about immigrant communities, we see a huge problem of them not being able to assimilate because guess what? They don't identify of being an American despite the fact that they know the language and they know the culture. We tell you that importance lies in identity when you know the social values and the social norms. We can't quantify what social norms are for you, Mr. Speaker. We will never be able to. But nonetheless, when you talk about the pillars of how America was built, when you talk about the pillars of how liberal democracy functions, those are the values that we want to check. We may not weed out all the terrorists or all the retarded bad people, but we think that a system, a minimum barrier, needs to exist in order for you as a country to sustain yourself. So ultimately, Mr. Speaker, if you believe that states have a moral obligation to sustain itself, the social norms that it upholds on, you have no choice but to vote for the closing government today.
Right, I thank the Speaker for a kind speech, and for the last substantive speech, I call upon the Member of Honour.
Can I start? In today's debate, the premise is when we talk about legal immigrants, ladies and gentlemen, because illegal immigrants is not today's debate. However, even when they have qualification as illegal immigrants in their current status quo, today's debate is adding a current standard by actually further making a barrier. And today's debate is whether or not that additional barrier is a benefit or a harm to our society or to liberal democracies. And under this debate, we think that the closing opposition wins today's debate because it clearly harms the liberal democracies. But now, as an extension, we would like to emphasize the perspective of immigrants, ladies and gentlemen. Why it's going to harm the immigrants and the values of immigrants. Before that, let's just rebut the government case. Their major presumption is because liberal democracies are so good and acceptable to any social values, we think that it's a good thing, it's no problem. However, that major premise should be fixed. Because, ladies and gentlemen, liberal democracies have very different values, even in different countries. Just as you see European countries having so many different values inside Europe. However, even liberal democracies discriminate a lot of people. Typically Muslims, ladies and gentlemen. We see that in the US and Europe, it basically means that you're now discriminating Muslims to come from these liberal democracies. We think that this is first not a good idea. Second of all, they say countries have rights, therefore this is a benefit. However, the opening government's major failure is that they never linked why, since you have a right, it's a clear benefit, ladies and gentlemen. Because we're going to prove you why it's not beneficial to each stakeholder in today's debate. But let's just move on to the closing government because I guess the major logic came from closing government and government side. Because they said that states rely on value, ladies and gentlemen. However, yes, we agree. That's because the only criteria of a certain social value comes from a state. So basically, when a liberal democracy is making this criteria, the only criteria is nationality, ladies and gentlemen. It's nothing furthermore. Therefore, you're not blocking an individual from Pakistan and accepting Pakistan. You're just blocking all of the Pakistanis, all of the Iranis, ladies and gentlemen. Because you have no other further standard. They never actually proved a specific standard out of it. It's not about mechanism, it's about the standard, ladies and gentlemen. Then they talked about why willingness, the major extension coming from the closing government, was the willingness comes from identity. However, we also deny this because willingness comes from the intention of changing and assimilating to that society. However, when we see a social value, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that social values do change. That was a major premise from us. Their major premise is that social values do never change. Therefore, it's fixed every time. However, just as she told you, Korean Americans are now identify themselves as Americans rather than the Koreans, ladies and gentlemen. When I see a Korean American from USA, I don't think he identifies him more as a Korean but as an American, ladies and gentlemen. That's the transition of an identity, that's a transition of a social value. So, they're basically saying since Korean Americans cannot assimilate, therefore we're just going to kick them out or prevent them from coming in. But we think that this is not a right direction, therefore it's clearly a harm. But now further, when I give you my extension, I'm going to show you why it is actually beneficial to currently stick with the status quo, not adding this criteria. My first extension will talk about what is the immigration standards and why this is enough. Second of all, we're going to talk about the nature of immigrants, which is very important. And third, we're going to talk about the harms that will come, the unique harms when we add this current standard. The first extension will talk about the immigration standard. Ladies and gentlemen, laws restrict immigration for economic or nationalistic political reasons. We agree with that. However, in the case, the justification comes when we talk about political reasons, when it clearly harms our society, when it clearly gives a tangible harm to our society. So the legal criteria gives quotas, point system, and also allows family ties. However, what we see from the government side is that they never prove the link by having a social value just directly leads to a tangible harm to our society. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we see that these legal immigrants are not harmful when we compare them to illegal immigrants who even agree with a certain society's value, ladies and gentlemen. We think that illegal immigrants tends to be more violent, tends to commit more crime. However, it doesn't mean that directly means that these legal immigrants who have different social values, different ideologies, do not accept also the values of the certain governments, and they do not. It means that we still believe in the possibility that they can change. But furthermore, not only this immigration standard, we think that we have to understand the nature of immigrants. Because why do immigrants go to foreign countries in the first place, ladies and gentlemen? Because nobody really talked about it. We think that immigrants, the nature of immigrants, goes to another country because they believe in a personal interest, where they want money, where they want to go for their families, but international marriage. Not only that, ladies and gentlemen, they have a belief that moving into another state brings a better life. That's the reason why they go. If they didn't believe in that, they would just have stayed in their state, ladies and gentlemen. However, we think that most of the immigrants do not, therefore, have any incentive to harm the country that they're going, ladies and gentlemen. Because they want to live there, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that immigrants just want to go there and screw another nation, and that's the reason why they immigrate. We think that in order for immigrants to receive the benefits of the government, for example, the access of public health system or proper housing, they always have this incentive to adapt to the society and follow the social norms, follow the social laws, since they have the qualification of as a legal immigrant, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that they will risk their status just because they have a different idea and a different ideology. Because they won't go there in the first place if they deny the whole social values in that state. They want to be assimilated, they want to go in there. Then they have to prove the majority of legal immigrants do have these oppositions of values. Therefore, we do not really stand in today's debate. Then let's move on to my last point, but before that, no.
If the citizens are already willing to abide by the social norms, they'll become citizens. But nonetheless, what we're trying to say is that what obligation does a state have to not set barriers?
Basically what she's saying is that since we're concerning that these nations might have different social values, now we're going to put a standard before they even come in, and therefore just block them out. We think that this is not a good idea because you're preemptively just overgeneralizing every legal immigrant to have different, have the same social values. Now I'd like to move on to my last point, unique harm. Government encourages social conflicts and only make unnecessary illegal immigrants, ladies and gentlemen. That's the unique harm that comes from this motion because you're making a bigger barrier. Government's only criteria of a social value is nationality, ladies and gentlemen. But it's overgeneralizing it because now government will deny Syrian immigrants or refugees just because the government is a dictator. Now they're saying that many European countries just deny the value of Muslims, therefore Muslims will have discrimination when they enter Europe, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this will not make them stop coming in, but you're basically leaving them as now an illegal immigrant, ladies and gentlemen. Because the major incentive of an immigrant going to another country is not because of a social value, it's because of belief that they can become an immigrant and enjoy the benefits out of it. Why is this bad? Government are just losing qualified legal immigrants, ladies and gentlemen, and now you're damaging the relationship with another state. We think that more illegal immigrants will cause further conflicts in the society, as the concerns of the government side say. We think that accepting legal immigrants and protecting them will minimize the conflicts and make our society better. So for these reasons, as we told you, we think that closing our opposition understood today's debate the most, and that is the reason why we strongly oppose this motion. Thank you very much.
Right, I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and to close out the case of government, I call upon Government.
burden of proof is very clear. Why is it important? Why is it legitimate for the states to pick new citizens who are willing to, or who show signs that they can abide by the prevailing social values when we do not really ask the question to the already existing citizens? We think that the harms were clearly proven by the closing government, that the preservation of the state relies on whether these citizens can identify themselves as citizens, whether these citizens truly feel that they belong in a community, that they belong in the state. We think that the closing opposition, as passionate as he was quite irrelevant. Why? Because the context or the stakeholders of the debate is very clear. Those who disagree with the existing values of the state, those who are nonetheless willing to become an immigrant. We think that by talking about the citizens, immigrants who have the willingness to abide by these existing values has nothing to do with the debate because they will pass the whatever exam that our OG vaguely set up. Right? Let's move on to what we have in this debate. Two questions. Number one, what is a citizenship? How can states define citizenship, and how does that have anything to do with immigrants? Number two, the consequences of our model. So let's move on to our number one clash. What is a citizenship? We think that it's like entering a contract, right? You exchange the state's resources, such as protection, such as welfare, such as political power that you give to the citizens, in exchange of citizens' duty or loyalty, right? Such as, your willingness to go to the military, your willingness to pay tax, your willingness to have national identity, right? Why? Because ultimately, my first speaker explained to you why is it important. Number one, for the states to exist, therefore create a net benefit together as a state. Number two, to have a sense of community, to have a sense of society, because that net benefit comes from existing as a society. If we gather random number of people and just call that a state, that's not really a state, because state is, in fact, a proof that there is a society that exists with a similar values, with a society that the society wants to aspire to as a community, right? So sit down. So to enter a contract, we clearly explained to you, Mr. Speaker, which is the unique contribution coming from closing government, that you need to be born in a state, right? Why is that important? Because, we assume that you can abide because of your tie to the community, because you have the environment of upbringing that were assimilated to the values that the society wants to aspire to. If you're born as an American, however, constricted your environment may be, you were exposed to the ideas of liberal democracy, to the ideas of capitalism. Therefore, the benefit of the doubt falls under the state, right? We were very clear about this. Number two, if we talk about new citizens, newcomers, immigrants, that burden of the proof falls down to these newcomers. Why? Because your entire upbringing and environment were the environment that were different from that of the states that you want to belong to. Sit down. Your identity or the value system was built elsewhere that is quite different, especially when the society was completely different. If you talk about the Muslims, right? We're not saying you will be denied because you're Pakistani. We're saying if you're a Pakistani with an extreme Muslim idea that believes that women have no right to begin with, that's a quite clear question to ask. That's a quite clear distinction. Not whether your identity is something from the different nation, but more importantly, whether your social values are completely different from that of the state that you want to belong to, right? So, you're really that radical. That's why you lose the debate. Sit down. So here's the question that OO has been asking constantly. What is the harm? We told you, Mr. Speaker, that the identity of an American comes from the fact that you like democracy. You have liberty in your state. The identity of an American comes from the idea of being a capitalist, quite importantly, right? We tell you, therefore, when you do not have those values inside you, you're less likely, you're quite rarely to believe in yourself, to be an American, to call yourself an American, to have the idea that you belong in a state called America, right? So if you start accepting, a state starts accepting people who are less likely, who will rarely identify themselves to be American, you're diluting the state itself. You're ultimately, in a way, wiping the state from existing. Ultimately, we tell you that's the harm big enough. That's a fundamental idea big enough for the state to reject these people who are less likely to become a state's member, right? So, opening, yes.
If an existing citizen explicitly rejects the federal state capitalism you talk about, does the government deport him or her?
So, I told you, Mr. Speaker, clearly the burden of the doubt, the benefit of the doubt falls to already existing citizens because of the already upbringing environment, because of the ties to the community. That does not exist to the newcomers. The burden of the proof falls to the newcomers. Yes, listen, okay? Okay? So let's move to rebuttals. OO told us that there is no such thing as right or wrong. We tell you it's not about right or wrong objectively, it's about whether the state has a society that has clear values within or not, whether states can or should not, right? So prevailing social values does exist, Mr. Speaker. Number one, like, distinction is very clear, like capitalism, socialism, right? Freedom, no freedom, right? So there is an existing prevailing ideas. And we tell you states always encourage, always discourages certain values to exist or not. Don't smoke, like don't beat women, like believe in freedom, right? States always have absolute right to do such things, and we see it all the time, therefore why not here, right? Lastly, they told us, NEAO told us like criteria is like nationality. We tell you it's ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. We said the standard is your willingness to change. The comparison is the status quo and the model that we propose. In the status quo, you don't even ask the question whether you're hardcore, like against the freedom of women or not, whether you are hardcore socialist or not. We tell you that the question has to be asked. In a way, the betterment falls under our model because the situations, now the burdens are different, right? Lastly, to the idea of consequences, right? We tell you about the perspective that the immigrants, again, the context isn't that. Number two, states simply do not have the burden to care for these people who are willing to accept over the people who already exist, over the security and the preservation of society that already exists. Number two, we tell you about the workforce idea. My first speaker completely crushed it, so I'm not going to deal with it anymore because you can just issue visas to them. We tell you about the idea of the minorities who already exist in the society. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, if you believe that women should be stoned to death when they cheat, maybe that's a value that should, in a way, be discouraged over the ideas that already exist in society. We tell you, okay, values can exist. You have absolute freedom to have that value, but nonetheless, the state will end up encouraging and discouraging such ideas. The state will end up, barring you from acting upon that value. Therefore, we tell you our values are, good, right? Our policy is in a way good, right? So, at the end of the day, closing up with the principles and the practical values that exist in this debate, we take this debate home. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech, and to close off the opposition case and the debate as a whole, I call for opposition.
I think Tony was quite afraid of responding to our very big distinctions. When you say we're simply irrelevant, I'm going to prove to why we're still in the debate, and we're quite at the top range of the debate in today's debate. When you simply say, that there's only two ways. Number one, you're either very opposing the value and never willing to go, and number two scenario, you're suddenly all supportive of a certain notion. We don't think that that's the only case. We think that experience of living within the borders of it changes your perception. So basically saying that even if I oppose the social values in the status quo, but I go to America as a Korean citizen and see different cultures, that's when I come to a social change. That's when perception change. Simply when under the opposing government's model, they talk about identity is so important. Under their logic, what we're going to see is simply we're going to have America as only American identity. Korea as only Korean identity. We think that itself is number one in practical status quo, and number two, we think that that's not a good value because if they're supporting liberal democracy, but diversity and respect of other minorities is also important, and simply arguing that we are Americans, sit down, we're Americans, we rock, and you guys all suck. That kind of attitude is that we don't want. Sorry, Joe, I'm not being offensive towards you. We think that the burden of government is very simple. Number one, they have to explain us a very exclusive harm coming from different social values. And secondly, they have to prove to us why barriers are necessary. So, through my two classes, I have two issues in today's debate. I'm going to tell you, number one, can social value be a criteria of judging upon the very presence of that person within domestic borders? Secondly, I'm going to compare the harms and benefits that came up in today's debate. And lastly, proving why closing opposition definitely take this debate at the end of the day. Let's go to the first class. When an opening government comes up to the podium and doesn't really define what social value you're talking about, they simply define what people believe in, what people think in. Then first, it diluted the whole opening house in general, right? When they talk about people don't like your identity, when you see people like hiding up their skins in layers of cloth, They think that, oh, that's very offensive, I'm suddenly losing my whole identity, I'm suddenly want to fight with that person. If that's the problem that they're arguing, so it simply is factually wrong, because even in France, if you see a woman in burqas, you don't have the kind of identity clashes, you don't have the kind of willingness to suddenly engage in a like fight that causes a tangible sit down and have tangible harm, right? And then it gets even worse when it goes to the closing government. Talk about citizens wrong. We agree, but the whole premise was that, you know, in order to protect these citizens, you need certain standards, you need certain criteria. We do have that in the status quo, Mr. Speaker. We go to Rome, we abide by the Rome law, Mr. Speaker, and law and social value is very different, Mr. Speaker. So when I go into the country and I don't kill people, I don't have hate speeches, I don't do anything that go against the very constitutional concept of that country, then I'm basically abiding by the CG's characteristics of citizens rocking, because I'm not harming that citizen, right? Sit down. The social values, when it comes to beliefs, we don't think that just because I believe in a different way, I believe in democracy is good or democracy is bad, or I like Muslims or I like Christians, that kind of sense of belief doesn't lead to tangible harm, Mr. Speaker. So basically, let's go into like debate terms and very nerdy examples. Just because I have a different belief in NEAO as other Chinese, Taiwanese, and Japanese debaters, do I suddenly go into a fight with them? No, Mr. Speaker. As long as you abide by the NEAO law of not smoking within buildings and like not engaging in physical contact, that's the exact reason why NEAO is so peaceful, right? Under their logic, just because people have so many different beliefs, sit down, please. Just because we have so different beliefs and we suddenly don't have like, these much tangible harms, that's not happening, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because we have laws to restrict that. We have different social values, and that is respected to the extent of me not infringing your social values, which we don't see in the status quo. Let's go. Let's go into what cooling opposition exclusively contributed in today's debate about regarding the first clash. He talked about the very specific criteria of immigration, which no side of the House in today's debate defined. We told you that when there's a direct threat to your national sovereignty, in the cases of the United Nations, defined that we can actually have restriction towards immigration when it comes to like, counterterrorism and whatnot. That's the exact reason there's a direct threat to the citizens' very welfare that CG always wanted. But we told that in this cases, when these immigrants already by work permits and existing laws have the obligation, have the willingness to abide by the local law, saying that I'm going to work under your conditions that you have set down, then simply saying that just because I'm a Muslim, just because I'm a Korean, doesn't make much of a difference in terms of that criteria. Still, when we don't have a clear tangible harm, still this lies within a line of closing opposition, right?
Mignon.
Before you go on.
Closing.
The crux of this debate is when a state has to deal with citizens that cannot identify with the very values that you support, how do we better go about this? It's setting a barrier to make sure and ensure that these people are willing to abide by the principles and laws that are set on social values.
Wonderfully leading to my second clash about harms and benefits. We told you that exclusive harm is overgeneralization. Back to NEAO example, just saying that, oh, you're a Japanese and you don't agree with Korean principles, then you're not going to even participate in NEAO. That's what they're arguing, Mr. Speaker. We're saying that coming to NEAO, yes, there might be conflicts in ideas, but since we're all moral, we're still all human, we don't engage in a fight. That's what closing opposition is still saying. But still, just because you're a Japanese, you're, I don't know, Muslim, you're LGBT, we don't want you in our society, that's kind of American pride that they think that is positive, but it's not a good value in the status quo, Mr. Speaker, right? So opening government, when they didn't have any specific harm, basically saying that we're not going to have any, we're not going to see any women in burqas in France. That's their only benefit. We don't think that how that's a benefit in the very first place. We're going to disregard the opening government. But when it comes to closing government, it talks about we can protect the sense of an identity. Wow, that's really good. We think that the sense of identity, Mr. Speaker, is still respected under our model. Why is this? Because the sense of identity is still protected, because when people still have different social values, they try to abide by the set standards. Why is this? Because we gave you a very clear characteristic of these immigrants. When they want to work and get money out of that country, when they want to contribute to society and send that money back to their own nations, they inevitably have to kind of avoid contact with these people, even if they have different beliefs, right? Because when like LGBTs come into Korea, when Korea still has a general social taboo against these LGBTs, they still say that they still don't go very openly on these issues. But still they abide by the social standards. They do have the willingness once they come into these borders, right? We tell you that by living in those countries, that's the very beginning of you having a social perception, saying that, oh, I still, even if I go against this value, once I come into this country, then I think, oh, this value is actually a good value that we can uphold. What's the exclusive harms that are brought? We tell you that overgeneralization is happening. Because when you see a terrorist, when you see Muslims and saying that, oh, we don't like Muslims because you're a terrorist, this kind of sense of generalization will happen. So basically saying that we're blocking out all precious assets that we can utilize in the status quo, Mr. Speaker. But also saying that the state-state relationship will also be deteriorated. Why is this? Because a general hate towards not an individual identity, but the social value as a whole will be denied by a single nation. We think that that itself is very offensive to these countries. So we want social integration, Mr. Speaker. We want these people to have a more culturally integrated life, and that only comes from closing opposition models. That's very proudly opposed.
I thank all speakers for their speeches. We cross the house and leave the room.